Now that we're all awake, that's right. Hey, can you tell it's almost the 4th of July?
Oh, yes.
Were there fireworks going off within your hearing range last night?
Yes.
There were mine. Got to tell you, it took me back a few years. It reminded me of when we had German Shepherds, and let's just say they were not, not too happy. They were not keen on fireworks. But it reminds me not just of Independence Day, which we're celebrating, but it reminds me as all the fireworks go off, and I imagine in my mind's eye the people shooting them off, and more importantly, even the people standing around enjoying them. I think of the kids of all ages, right, that are enjoying them. And it makes me think of how much we as Americans love to celebrate. We love to celebrate. We are people that love to celebrate. And we love to celebrate our independence. It is a huge part of the American identity. And so we celebrate the 4th of July, as we often call it, but it's really Independence Day. And independence speaks of something in particular that is also near and dear to our hearts, and that is freedom. And I don't mean to say that they're separate, but when we talk about independence, well, we're talking about independence from. We're talking about independence from dependence. We're talking about independence from oversight from another. We're talking about independence from whatever it is that keeps us from being able to do what we want, keeps us from being able to make our own decisions and choose how we want to use what we have. It's not all bad by any means, and it's part of what makes the American dream to especially people in other parts of the world that don't enjoy that same freedom. They want to come and be with us. They want to be able to enjoy the fruits of their labor as they choose. And in spite of all that has taken place and changed in our society that we don't like, we are still one of the most free people in the world. And we celebrate that in our independence. Now, I want to take you back. Some of you are old enough, I don't know if all of you are, but there was a phrase used a number of years ago, footloose and fancy free. That's an old saying I used to hear. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, but according to wordhistories.net, if you want to look it up, the phrase footloose and fancy free means not committed to or tied to anyone or anything. And in particular, not emotionally involved with or committed to anyone. Footloose and fancy free. Again, for some of you who are old enough to remember, or maybe you just know this from hearing others talk about it, of all the decades in American history, more recent, I should say, what decade might be known most? I didn't even have to finish it. Some of our representatives of that era, right? Yeah, it does represent the 60s, and in some ways, it represents good. In other ways, it represents the not so good. And the not so good part of it, while I don't want to major on that this morning, the not so good part of it would be to take that freedom or that liberty and to abuse it, right? To use it for purposes that it really wasn't meant for. And so you get a bad rap, and that often goes along with that, although I've heard it used in a way that indicates a lightheartedness, a spirit-free kind of, a free spirit kind of a way. Footloose and fancy free. So it's a loaded phrase, and it comes with a lot of different meanings. I bring that up to you today because I suspect that any informed American, any American today that has been paying attention over the last several years in particular, is wrestling with what does the American ideal of freedom mean today, as we have watched freedoms be abused, freedoms be limited, depending on the side that you're on. We've talked about the divisions in our country and how people on both sides feel like they are losing freedoms. And I wonder what that means for us this morning as we anticipate celebrating Independence Day. Now, even more so because of the context when we're in a church today. What does it mean to those of us who are Christian? What does this whole notion of independence, of freedom, and of possibly losing freedoms or abusing freedoms have to do with us as Christians? Well, I want to invite you this morning to turn in your Bible, your scripture, to the letter to the Romans. I always hesitate a bit when I go to enter into the letter of Romans to preach from, because it is a weighty piece of material. It is a weighty work. It is known worldwide as Paul's most theologically dense and probably the apex of his writings. And how do you come at a sermon that's so limited in time and do any justice at all to any part of the book of Romans when you can't study just a little bit? You've got to study a whole lot to even understand the little bit that you're considering. So it's intimidating for me, and I confess that up front. But I want to come to it this morning, particularly in chapter 6, because it just speaks so poignantly this morning to the notion of being free people being independent. Paul has been talking throughout the letter to the Romans about this notion of being free, of being freed by the work of God through Jesus Christ. And he's been making a defense of it in some ways, but in the part we're going to consider today, he expands that to the degree of not just what it offers us, but also how it, well, if we take it for what it's meant, it limits us. It's a self-imposed limit, if you will. So I invite you to turn in chapter 6 to verse 12, where we're gonna start reading. And I normally preach to you out of the NIV, so if you've turned there this morning, my apologies. I want to redirect you. I want to redirect you to the Contemporary English Version, the CEV. I really like the way it captures, for this morning's sermon, what Paul is saying to the Romans. Verse 12, so do not let sin control your life here on earth, so that you do what your sinful self wants to do. Do not offer the parts of your body to serve sin as things to be used in doing evil. Instead, offer yourselves to God as people who have died and now live. Let me read that again and listen to it in the context of being people who have been freed, people who are now independent. Do not let your sin control your life here on earth. As Christians, we often think of sin as being something we've been set free from, right? When we talk about our independence, we talk about being set free by the work of Christ so that we're free from sin. And yet, in a different context, you and I both acknowledge that we still struggle with temptation to sin. There is still evidence of the workings of sin. And if nothing else, we certainly can look in our past and see the effect of sin and the need for this incredible work of Christ. So there's an acknowledgement to the past of sin's control while calling our attention to the fact that we're now free. Don't let sin control your life here on earth so that you do what your sinful self wants to do. Do not offer the parts of your body to serve sin as things to be used in doing evil. Instead, offer yourselves to God as people who have died and now live. Paul goes on to say, offer the parts of your body to God to be used in doing good. And by parts, by the way, just so that you know, he's speaking of the whole person. He's not just talking about our physical members. He's talking about our minds. He's talking about our attitudes. He's talking about our will. He's talking about our choices. He's talking about our whole being, everything about us. Offer ourselves fully, if you will, to God to be used in doing good. And then this, sin will not be your master, because you are not under the law, but under grace. If you jump down to verse 16, in the middle of the verse, he says, the person you obey is your master. You can follow sin, which brings spiritual death, or you can obey God, which makes you right with him. So when he starts off talking about we are free, and then he gets into the passage today and he says, don't let sin control our lives, and don't offer ourselves to serve sin. He's very much trying to paint this picture of the fact that even though we're free, we're still reporting to a master. And he's exhorting us, he's challenging us, he's calling on us not to let sin be that master. Now, I wouldn't blame you if you step back for a minute and you say, well, wait a minute. I thought he's talking about freedom. I thought he's talking about our independence. We've been set free from this master of sin. Why does he then talk about obeying your master? Why does he then talk about obeying God, which makes you right with him? I thought we were already set free. You see, what Paul's getting at is the reality that every one of us that accepts Jesus' work on the cross has been set free, but not free from having any master. Free from having the master of sin. For as long as we are in these bodies, in this redeemed from fallen state creatures, if you will, we still answer to someone. And in fact, we always will. It's not a matter of being totally independent with no master at all, as somewhat celebrated by Footloose and Fancy Free. It's a choice of which master we serve. One master enslaves us. Another master sets us free. He enables us and empowers us to live according to his way, which is good and right and true and holy. And we're given the freedom to live that out. I don't have to spend much time talking about what it's like to live under the mastery of sin. You and I both know that what makes the temptation so powerful is the fact that it's hard to resist. And shockingly, the first time we give in, and we think, well, just this one time. What happens? Oh, it grows in power. He comes back with more. Hey, that was good. Let's do it again. It's not a freedom to go on. It's an enslavement. It's a being challenged to do again and again and again what takes us down and makes us guilty before the eyes of the Lord. But it also leaves us with regret. It leaves us with dread, anticipating when that temptation comes up again. It's not at all freedom. And yet, when we are released from the power of sin, when we are set free to follow God in his way, yes, we are slaves to his way of living, but we have the privilege of choosing that. God doesn't force us to do anything. He enables us to be with him in right relationship, and he gives us all of these good ways to follow. And sin, right on that shoulder, keeps talking about how, oh, but you can't do this and you can't do that. Even in our freedom, sin keeps nipping at our heels, trying to drag us back in. Paul is exhorting us this morning. You can follow sin. You can answer that temptation. But ultimately, it leads to spiritual death, which is what? Separation from God eternally. Or you can obey God, which makes you right with him. I chose this particular translation, the CEV, because of the way it ends with that, because it makes you right with Him. That struck me this morning as we talk about and celebrate independence. What does the notion of being right with God have to do with our independence? Well, isn't the fact that our sin emerged from the very beginning by our choosing to be our own God, our choosing our own way, our choosing my choice, if you will, and not His instruction, my way instead of His way, my belief that somehow following His way would limit me. That's what the enemy presented to Adam and Eve. And what was the fallout? Separation, right? We were kicked out of the garden. And from that point on, humans have struggled to be in right relationship with God. Now you see in traditional translations the righteousness of God. But righteousness is a loaded term, and it's often not fully explained in the different passages. So I wanted to bring it back to this translation this morning because it helps us see what Paul is talking about. This otherwise everlasting separation that we would all experience from God has been replaced. Jesus has made a way for us to be back in good relationship, right relationship with the Father. And so even though we may feel as coming out of our sinful state that we're having to give up this and this and this and this to follow Him, in fact, being back in relationship with Him is a gift we can't earn. It's a gift we couldn't get any other way. And it's a gift once we receive it. We also receive the power of the Holy Spirit to now say no to what we couldn't say no to before. As we celebrate independence today, as we celebrate the notion of being free from dependence, I want us to celebrate the fact that actually we are still dependent on the only one who can give us true freedom. It's counter to a lot of what we hear celebrated in our culture. It's counter to what we would ourselves hope for when we're struggling underneath temptation. But it's in fact the only true freedom. And once experienced, you begin to see another power at work. Not a power that continues to drag you back down in the depth, back down in the dirt, back down in the feeling of being wrong, insufficient, rebellious. It gives us the power to be free, to say no to whatever it is that's been burdening us. And God helps us overcome. Truly, that's something to celebrate when we celebrate freedom. There's a dual focus. There's the being freed from, as we've talked before, but there's the also being freed to. The freed to, well, the freed from is from wrath. What we deserve from turning away from God. But the freed to, the freedom of being made pure. The freedom of being as we wish we could be, but have no means on our own of accomplishing. It is a freedom that once experienced. And I know you've experienced this. But it's a freedom of once you've actually tasted it. It can't be replicated. And so I wonder today, as we celebrate independence, and as we watch others celebrate independence, what do we have to share with them? What do we have to share with those who don't know Him at all about a real freedom that is available? And how would we demonstrate it to them? How would we help them to see a freedom unlike any other? I wonder how it would be displayed in the context of being an American today, with all the division and all the striving to get my way and what I want. How can you and I today, as followers of Jesus, as those made free, not just from the wrath, but those who actually have it power in us, the one making us pure, how can we demonstrate that as we find ourselves facing these different dividing issues? What does the Lord call on us to do? The person you obey is your master, Paul says. If we are following Jesus as our master, if we are obeying Jesus as our master, if we are living out the ways of His teachings, hasn't He promised us in both the Old and New Testament that we will impact the world around us for good? Perhaps our message today as we celebrate independence is that the freedom God has given us truly makes us free. And that true freedom overcomes all of the things we as a society are now so deeply burdened with. I hope you'll consider that today and tomorrow and Tuesday as we celebrate Independence Day. And may the Father's great gift of Jesus and the Father and Jesus' great gift of the Spirit who empowers us to be free be held high and celebrated.